Hello everyone, it's Kelly Folsom here, and welcome back to another Vital Art session. In today's lesson, we're going to be doing something a little bit differently, and that is painting with our palette knife in this setup with a brass pot and a few apples. So it'll just be trying to explore how to use your palette knife to paint with and the benefits of that versus a paintbrush. So let's dive in and get started. Okay, so what I would recommend if you're going to try a palette knife painting would be to go ahead and get some kind of loose, very loose drawing, just simple shapes. At least that way you've got something to start with here. And then I have two different palette knives. One is a little bit longer, one is a little bit shorter. They're both kind of a diamond shape, but perhaps that would give me a little bit of variety. This one's a T29 Creative Mark, and this is a Jack Richardson. I do like the Richardsons because they're made in Italy. They're very well made. They last forever. I think this one says 824. So, okay. But other than that, the procedure is really just the same. The benefit of working with, let's say, a palette knife is that it really does teach you to use good paint. So to really lay on the paint, you don't really have any choice but to use a lot of paint. So that's just what we're going to sort of plow forward and do here. I'm going to use some alizarin for this apple and cab red light for the lit side. I'm going to do alizarin and ultramarine blue for the shadow side. And because you can't get too fussy, you know, you perhaps make a little bit of a mess in the beginning. I do the same thing with my knife I would do with the brush. I, wipe off the palette knife whenever I go to mix with a different color. So then over to the green apple, I'm going to use my cool lemon yellow. You could use a different blue in this case. I still just have ultramarine blue out. That's the blue I most often use, but you could use Prussian or phthalo. So again, a lighter version here. And stuff like that's going to happen where things sort of creep over and into another area, and that's okay. And that's actually how you want to be painting with your brush as well, is sort of overlapping the edges so that you don't end up with these little outlines around everything. So I'm just going to use some black and ivory black and blue and cad yellow deep for my shadow color on this. And actually I'm going to take it a little touch lighter, but not too light at this stage because I don't have enough of the background stuff in to really figure out if that value is going to work. But again, keep in mind, we are trying to always be vigilant about that contrast. Contrast between the shadow and the light. Contrast between color. Value of shadow and light, and color of shadow and light. We want more color in the light, less color in the shadow. So I just wanted to make that a little bit bigger shape there. I take this shadow mixture all underneath here. The only downside to doing this is that it's difficult to get, let's say, some softer edges. It can also be difficult to get a lot of thin versus thick. You can get some variety there in the thin versus thick, but what you could do in the end, you could always pull some paint off with your brush or soften some edges. This is the brush that I drew with and blocked in with. But so you might have a soft hair brush. You might pull out a soft hair brush at the very end to kind of soften a few edges. But the primary goal here is to teach you how to put on paint. So basically I'm just lightening this shadow color with a little more cad yellow, the two cad yellows for the form shadow on brass. The other thing that it's helpful for is, a lot of times I'll see students put on paint like this, all one direction or all up and down. And again, you can see the brush tends to deposit paint a little thinner. So, but also the direction of the strokes. So it doesn't teach you about making directional brush strokes, but it just gets you away from making the same repetitive brush stroke, and I think gets you into thinking more about painting flatly, where the paint is flatly applied because you have no other choice with the palette knife, and seeing in big shapes. So there are definitely some benefits to working with the palette knife. So I would definitely give it a shot. The only thing I would caution you about is that you know, you do eventually want to make sure that you learn how to use the brush to the best of your ability. But I typically use both. I use knife and brush a lot. And in fact, I think it's good to basically vary the tools that you're using throughout the painting. So there's shadow underneath here. And I'm going to go ahead and get in. Now I could kind of make it thinner by pulling in some of my Merige to kind of actually physically thin the paint. I would like to get in just something kind of darker back here. As you can see, the palette knife doesn't really like to hold that on there if it gets too liquidy, but you could kind of apply it on there a little bit thinner. If it gets too thin, you could add some more paint, but I'd like to try to get some of this shadow color back here. And in this case, I'll have to kind of scrape it, push it around. That might definitely be something that before the painting is over that I'll have to take a soft hair brush to. Again, I want to paint over these edges rather than just painting around the contours. You can always come back in and restate the contour a little more defined. But like all this shadowy area, I would rather lose the edge right now and then bring back in definition later on. Okay, so there is cast shadow on this side from the pot, casting a shadow behind the apple. We definitely need that contrast. So I'm just kind of trying to mix up like a murky green here. And getting some of this in will help me figure out the appropriate value for the form shadow on this apple, the green apple. Again, let's just paint right over the edges. I think another thing that this is helpful for is if you're the type of person that is really uncomfortable with your painting looking kind of ugly in the beginning. I think all good paintings look kind of rough, a little rough and tumble in the beginning while they're building. So some of this color on the table edge. Bringing in some more reds and orange to warm that up. I may just bring that all the way down in this case. I think with a knife too, it's like you've got to do such big shapes that you tend to not overmix. So you get a lot of these interesting things happening where maybe you've got a little bit of blue and a little bit of pure red floating through something, rather than, you know, too homogeneous of a mixture going on. Okay, so in the light on this pot, I'm gonna kind of use some of that warmish mucky color plus the cool cad lemon Reason being is because it's not as pure of a color as the apple over here. So that table edge color that had a little bit more orange in it would just neutralize some of that cool yellow lemon. And again, thinking of contrast, value contrast and color contrast. And I still do want to be thinking thin versus thick. I'm going to add a little bit more color and light with a little more Naples yellow, little more of the lemon yellow right here where the band of the highlight is going to be. This isn't really highlight as much as it is just sort of like that, another little layer of light that the highlight will sit on top of. And on this metal too, you can do broken strokes, which will kind of get the texture of that metal started. And you can, smooth, one thing into another to get a softer gradation, kind of dragging some of the light up into that shadow to get sort of a softer turn. Same thing down here. Because metal is super reflective, I want to get some of this red. So I'll just kind of pull down some of this red as it's sort of showing up in the underplane. Again, let's just, it might actually also be a good idea just to kind of drag some of this out into the metal and then re-establish that starting edge of the apple. So let's get I feel like maybe that color was a little too basic there on the apple. It's not that brilliant of a red, so I'm going to take some of this Venetian red, some of my alizarin. Let's maybe get a little more subtle red here. Let's try it. It's always kind of a fine line between how much do you copy reality. Does that lead to a more boring painting, perhaps? And if so, you definitely want to infuse it with a little more interest or drama. But sometimes you might go one direction where perhaps it feels so unrealistic, and that's perhaps not a good thing. And you might go the other direction where you are trying to get all these grays and subtle desaturated colors, and it loses the excitement in the painting. And we've got this beautiful reflected light. So in that case, you can, load up more just the edge rather than the whole palette knife. And as we start to get to smaller shapes, you may actually want to start to switch to the smaller knife. This whole back edge has really got a lot of this color of the green apple showing up in it. Okay, so I want to get some more background color in so that I can get to that handle. So I'm going to do some yellow ochre, some ultramarine blue to get that nice kind of sagey green back there. Okay, that looks like it's probably going to be a little too yellow. So a little more blue, a little more black. And this time let's do a little Naples yellow, see if we can kind of cool that off a bit. It's so similar to what's in the pot that I think it'll just fight the pot too much. And there's just some really beautiful value changes going on, lights and darks that are going on right here on the pot against that handle. So the shadow side of this pot is actually darker than the background. Once again. And so you can kind of grab some, pull it over, mix on the actual painting itself, and I do that with a brush too. But it's almost a little easier to get a gradation this way, where you start off lighter and cooler and then slowly start to kind of blend the two together with your knife to get more of a subtle value change. Okay. So there is a nice dark accent right underneath. It's a little darker than what the actual shadow color is here. Right underneath there. So black and crimson there to take that a little bit darker. There's also some nice cast shadow here on the foot coming out. I do try to keep the paint still kind of flat in that shadow stuff. So to try to maintain some of the thinner, flatter color in the shadow and thicker, more textural color in the light. We've got a edge here on the brass. So sometimes what you might have to do is kind of mix up the color broadly with a knife and then kind of scrape it up into a smaller pile. You know, kind of flip that over. Then if you have a smaller area, you could just pick up just a little bit of it, you know. This looks a little bit lighter, so I'm going to try that. To start to bring some light out on the rim of this. So what you might do first is kind of draw it with like it's one line at first, and then come back on top with a little bit smaller knife. And actually we need to kind of hit this whole thing. Now the paint's super wet underneath, so it may be wise if you are doing this to kind of start laying down all the paint, and then before you do highlights or more finer details, step away for a little bit, let the paint set up, let the paint do a lot of work for you. When the paint is really, really wet in the beginning, it's just kind of harder to manipulate. And I mean, I do this, I've been doing this for years for demonstrations, because you're just forced, you know, I like to show people where I'm going with it, but it is a little harder to do whenever it's super wet like that. So there is a little more light against this back edge. There's a, you know, this depth of shadow that is down on the inside of the pot, and I already have that in there. But now I kind of need to bring this back edge. I'm going to use a lot of my background color in the mix to really push that color back into space, regardless if I see that color or not. And then let's say if you get a little too thick, you can also kind of scrape, kind of pull some of that paint off. I should have showed you that, but on the palette knife. Okay, just kind of going through and filling in. We need some kind of gold color down here on the foot. Nothing too bright though. This is the brightest part. Just like in painting with a brush, we need cast shadow underneath. Again, if you get too thick of an edge, just kind of take your palette knife and pull it back off. And I would like to get some of this eucalyptus, because in every painting you want to have something that's colorful, something that is dark, something that's kind of duller, something that is light in value, kind of lighter in value, maybe not as colorful as, let's say, the apples. So that's why, you know, it could be like a white cloth or, you know, something lighter and whiter. But in this case, I put some of these little eucalyptus leaves in here. So just to show you too, whenever you want to make a little stem like that, pull to where you get just the tip, the edge again, you know which edge it's on, and then you can, you know, just put pressure on that one side. Okay. Okay, so that means we've got about 5 minutes left. So now that I've got a little piece of that lightest value, that also helps me see a better context for the highlight that's on the brass, right? So it's now the color and light on the brass makes a little bit more sense. Since I've got some of this color of background already on my palette mixed up, I'm going to add some of that Naples yellow light, just a little bit for some of these that are in the background, because these are in shadow, so they're a little bit darker than this one, and they do have a little more color. So ultramarine blue, some yellow ochre, and Naples yellow light. And it's nice too, you may not ever see this happen where one is literally darker than the other, but in your painting it'll work better, again, if you to show overlaps. You know, sometimes you have to make some things up a little bit. Like, okay, it'll just look better in the painting if this back leaf is perhaps a little lighter than the one in front, so on and so forth. So we've got some leaves there. And let's say if you don't get something right where you want it, which does happen, you could take some of the background color and kind of flatly start to push that paint I just put down, push it down, and shape it and perhaps get a sharper edge with the knife. So it's the same thing I would do with brush. It's just a little bit different type of control. Do you feel like this contrast needs to go a little bit darker here, just so that whenever I put that handle on, it will really pop. So again, we always start the edge sharper where we want to see the contrast, and then we can just kind of take and pull and drag, either with, in this case, the knife, to blend. We can sew these two edges together, kind of smush. Again, if you wait a little bit, this may be a little easier for you to do it. Okay, because we do have that handle. So here we go. I actually don't really see the handle showing up until out about here in this lighter value. So I am not going to start in full light. I'm not going to draw the handle in full light all the way on the inside. So, you know, try not to put things in until you see them clearly. And try to only put what you're seeing there in, instead of like, oh, I want to draw the whole handle in. Well, wait until you have the right value and the right color to really get it on there. So we've got a little bit of highlight here on the top. Should mention too, highlights on metal have a lot of local color in them. So if their basic color is yellow or green, or in copper, in the case of copper, it might be reds and oranges. It's going to have a lot of local color in it. Rather than, if you look at the highlight on the apples, there's very little local color. They perhaps just feel more white. We've got this nice reflected light going on in the brass as well from the green apple. Okay, so speaking of highlights on apples, you notice I'm using these angles on the apples. They're not perfect round balls. They do have these planes that are more angular. So I actually tried to make, one palette knife stroke this direction, one this direction, perhaps one this direction. And the highlights always fall on the corners where those planes, those more angular planes meet. There's a little bit of light catching on that underside, and that kind of crept over just a little too far, but that's okay. Can bring back in some crimson. So whether or not you decide to attempt this with a palette knife or not, all of the same principles apply, whether you're using a brush or whether you're using a knife. I like to steal a little bit of this background color to cool and desaturate some of that color. Still feel like, maybe I would like to see just a little stronger hit of light on that brass. Again, last but certainly not least, if you don't have this in your painting will just feel a little bit weaker and duller, and that is tabletop light. Wherever the light is hitting on that tabletop plane. And I want to have a crisp edge on the front edge of the tabletop plane if I can get it. There's a little beautiful peekaboo of light back here in between the two apples. That just helps to deepen the sense of space. I try to maintain some sort of contrast, sharper edge, and just like the sharper edge against cast shadows. So cast shadows, you're going to have sharper edges. Form shadows, you're going to have softer edges. So I might build up color or light here and then really try to make sure I get a thick enough layer and a sharp enough edge where the light meets the base of that apple where it's sitting on the ground plane. Then after the paint sets up a little bit, I can just kind of move paint around. I mean, this is part of the beauty of using enough paint, regardless if you're using a palette knife or not, and that is when you have enough paint on your surface, you can do such beautiful things with it. So it's almost better to paint too thick in the beginning whenever you're learning and you perhaps feel out of control. It feels sloppy, messy. Your first attempts may be a total disaster. You may want to fling your painting across the room, but that's okay. So the only way you're going to learn to control oil paint is by actually using it. And oil paint especially gets better, whenever you use more of it and fuss with it less, if that makes sense. So in other words, the least amount of blending and fussing with the paint you can do, the better. The more deliberate And if you do need to change something, it's almost always better to put fresh paint on top than to, say, just try to keep blending on it and hope that it gets better. Because if you're blending with a dry brush, what's happening is there's no paint on the brush and you're actually just taking paint off. So by a lot of times when people are blending, they're actually making it weaker because they didn't have enough paint to begin with. So I'm glad that somebody recommended, one of the members recommended that we do a palette knife painting, because it does, it kind of just gives a different way to talk about the same issue and also to kind of demonstrate the benefits of that. So if you have enough paint on, you can push and pull it around. You can layer on top. If you need to give it some time to set up before you come back and do something a little more finer, then that's okay. You work with the nature of the paint. Okay. Thank you all so much for watching, and I wish you all happy painting. Bye.